Hello, Robs. We're back with Anyone's Son, a true story by Roberta Roche with Harry De La Roche Jr. I believe this is chapter 8, section 27. While people were assessing the tragedy and trying to answer the whys, the friends and survivors of the De La Roche family prepared to bury their dead. On the Monday morning following the crime, John Grier and his sister-in-law, Carol Malley, drove to the Montvale headquarters to gain admittance to the Grand Avenue home where they hoped to find wills and cemetery deeds. Carol had taken time off from her job in the offices of a major department store because she wanted to spare John from doing more than he had to do in the upstairs of that house. The house was in disarray, she said, and the scenes were very unpleasant. Violence was evident in the hallway, a master bedroom, and on the attic stairs. We confined ourselves to the master bedroom as we searched for strong boxes or other containers which might have the information we needed. There's their death notices. And the December 1st, 1976 edition of the Record in Hackensack, New Jersey. The cops inventoried every item we removed. Then we sat in the car to go through papers. He also had to get underwear and things for Harry for jail. When the morning search yielded no directions for burial arrangements, John and Carol drove to Park Ridge to the Robert Spearing Funeral Home. After conferring with Mr. Spearing, I telephoned Harry Sr.'s family and discussed suggested arrangements in detail, recalled John Grier. Harry's family concurred with them, so next we selected caskets, set tentative visiting hours, and made arrangements to purchase plots at George Washington Memorial Park Cemetery in Parnassus. Later in the evening, we went back to the house, and Carol and Roy Nielsen went along to pick out clothes for the burial. Mike O'Donovan was there from the police to do what he could do. We selected a simple dress and pearls for Mary Jane, a business suit for Harry Sr., and leisure suits for the boys, Carol Malley remembered. I've tried to block this from my mind, and I seldom discuss it, she confided. But when Roy and I went to the boys' back bedroom, it was an absolute nightmare. The room was so bloody from the shooting and bludgeoning, I had to run out to the hall. Mike offered to get me some coffee, but I couldn't have swallowed the thing. The trunk that held Ronnie's body was blood-stained and in the hall. On Tuesday, Arden ordered Harry's flower arrangement to be placed by his mother's head and asked that no card be included. Then she asked Robert Spearing not to discuss those flowers. Later, when the press asked if Harry sent flowers, he honored her request. On Wednesday night, the viewings began, and the viewers filed through the funeral home till the funeral on Friday morning. Some came because they were mourners, others were the curious. Although John Grier originally started the funeral arrangements, Harry Sr.'s next of kin decided Honey Ebneter should do it for Harry Sr. and the boys. The Griers and the Ebneters concurred with this. So at the viewing and funeral, John and Arden represented the maternal side, while the Ebneters and other De La Roches were there for the paternal side. There were also a number of cousins on the paternal side. For the most part, things went fairly well, except for two disagreements. First, there was the matter of whether the casket should be opened. Then there was the question of why anyone would feel anything but hatred toward young Harry. In fact, one relative felt so bitter that he said in front of three people, John Grier, Roy Nielsen, and Robert Spearing, that he'd like to kill Harry Jr. for what he'd done to the family. When we took the clothes to Robert Spearing, I, as the pastor, saw the bodies. Roy Nielsen recollected the bullet holes were evident, and Ronnie looked so swollen I wouldn't have known it was Ronnie. What was left of Eric's face had been all covered by cotton. John Grier made it clear that Mary Jane's casket would be closed. But Honey Ebneater kept wondering about opening up the others. I knew the sight that she would see, so I put my arm around her and said, "You know, honey, there are going to be many people here, and people being average will look for the bullet holes. Maybe you don't want your son and his family to be remembered that way. We could keep the caskets closed and put photographs on top." At first, Honey seemed to concur. Then one of the relatives responded, "People have got to see this. I also want to see Eric." Roy, with his unusual compassion, tried to protect him from this. "I can describe everything," he told him. "I can assure you he's there." But the relative had to see him, and when they opened the casket in private, he naturally went to pieces. He agreed Eric's casket should be closed. Ronnie's and Harry Sr.'s were open at the funeral home. Some of the De La Roches took a dim view of Pastor Nilsson for the way he'd befriended Harry from the moment he heard of the crime, and a few other people felt hostile too, because of the pastor's offer to take Harry into his home. Although I got some very supportive calls and tender cards and letters from all over the country, I also received some crank calls, he said. One of the callers, and my youngest boy took it, threatened to take a shot at me for offering to do this for Harry. For the 2 days of the viewings, the caskets were lined in a semicircle with floral arrangements between them, and most of the time emotions were relatively well controlled. The Bickertons cried as they knelt by the coffins, and then they said to Roy, "If only we'd been home on Saturday when Harry came to the house. If only we'd had him for dinner and been there to talk with him." Later, the girls from Eric's class filed by his casket, and when each put a nosegay on the floor beside it, Honey, who was sitting by Eric, was so overcome that she fainted. On December 3rd, the day of the funeral, the weather was sub-freezing, but news reporters and television cameras were gathered at Christ Lutheran Church as early as 8:30. Prior to the mid-morning service, the 4 caskets arrived from the funeral home, and the impact of the 4 coffins was something that was hard to describe. Arden Greer broke down and cried as the enormity of it struck her at that moment. The caskets were placed in a semicircle below a wooden cross, and members of community organizations carried the 4 coffins. When it was time for the funeral, nearly 400 people were there, and the service began with the congregation singing "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Then Roy Nilsson rose and said quietly, "Spirit of God, things are swirling through my heart and mind. You promised you would give your men the right things to say. God, how I need that help now. This tragedy has caused many parents and teenagers to reassess their relationships, and if parents and teenage kids can love and communicate, some strange good will come out of this. We are quick to assess blame. The solution is not in fixing blame, but in fixing hurts." Then he paused before he continued, "I can't stand here without praying for that boy in prison and hoping your love and wisdom might reach out and envelop him. May God do his work with Harry, too." When Roy concluded his homily, Cindy Christensen, who sang like Julie Andrews, brought an unforgettable moment to the day with her solo, "Love Them Now." Don't wait till they've gone away. Love them now while they're around. Touch them, hold them, laugh and cry with them. Show them, tell them, don't deny with them. Love them now. Before they're just a guilty memory. Love them now. Love them now. At the graveside service at George Washington Memorial Park, relatives huddled in the freezing weather as Roy let a handful of fresh brown earth form a cross on each of the caskets. The flag from Harry Sr.'s was folded and given to Honey. Then the funeral procession made its way back to Christ Lutheran Church for a lunch that parishioners who had wanted to do something had prepared for the family and friends. The emotional climate was quiet and mixed with both grief and relief. At last, the unbelievable tragedy was over, for one day at least. And that's the end of chapter 8. And We shall return with chapter 9, bravs. Goodbye.
Goodbye.